In the winter of 1513, as Niccolò Machiavelli penned his observations on power from his modest villa in Sant'Andrea, he understood a truth that would echo through centuries: the greatest fortress a man can build is not of stone and mortar, but of disciplined thought and strategic consciousness. The prince who conquers territories may lose them to stronger armies, but the prince who conquers his own mind creates an empire that cannot be besieged. The essence of Machiavellian mental strategy begins with a fundamental recognition that most men are prisoners of their own weaknesses, slaves to impulses they neither understand nor control. They react where they should respond, they hope where they should calculate, they trust where they should verify. These men, no matter their titles or territories, are already defeated before any external enemy appears. They have allowed their weak selves to remain in command, and thus they invite destruction from every quarter. But the man who systematically destroys his weak self through deliberate mental discipline creates something remarkable, an unassailable position from which to observe, plan, and act. This is not mere self-improvement in the modern sense, but rather a complete reconstruction of consciousness itself. It requires understanding that the mind, like any territory, must be conquered before it can be effectively governed. The weak self manifests in predictable patterns that Machiavelli observed among the failed princes and fallen republics of his era. It appears as emotional reactivity that clouds judgment, as wishful thinking that substitutes for careful analysis, as moral rigidity that prevents necessary flexibility, and as comfort-seeking that breeds complacency. Each of these represents a vulnerability that enemies can exploit, a weakness that will eventually invite destruction. Consider how emotional reactivity destroys strategic thinking. When a man allows anger to dictate his responses, he becomes as predictable as the sunrise. His enemies need only provoke the right emotions to cause him to act against his own interests. History overflows with examples of rulers who lost kingdoms because they could not master their tempers, generals who lost battles because they took tactical suggestions as personal insults, and merchants who lost fortunes because they confused business decisions with matters of honor. The disciplined mind, however, creates what Machiavelli understood as the ultimate strategic advantage: the ability to think clearly when others cannot, to see patterns when others see only chaos, and to act decisively when others are paralyzed by emotion or uncertainty. This clarity becomes a form of intelligence that transcends mere cleverness or education. It represents a fundamental understanding of how human nature operates and how that knowledge can be systematically applied. The process of mental reconstruction begins with honest self-assessment, though not the kind that modern psychology might recommend. This is not about feeling better about oneself or building self-esteem, but about conducting a cold, analytical audit of one's mental habits, emotional patterns, and decision-making processes. It requires asking uncomfortable questions. What situations consistently trigger poor decisions? What emotions most frequently cloud judgment? What comfortable assumptions prevent clear seeing? This analysis must be conducted with the same dispassionate objectivity that a general uses to assess enemy positions. Personal feelings about what the analysis reveals are irrelevant, only accuracy matters. The man who cannot see his own weaknesses clearly will never be able to address them effectively, and thus will remain vulnerable to those who can see them more clearly than he can. Once the landscape of personal weakness has been mapped, the work of systematic elimination begins. This is not a project of gentle self-improvement but of strategic demolition. Each weak pattern must be identified, isolated, and destroyed through deliberate practice and rigid discipline. The man who wishes to become mentally unassailable cannot afford the luxury of gradual change or comfortable compromises with his weaker nature. The cultivation of strategic thinking requires developing what Machiavelli called the ability to see with the eyes of others. This means learning to anticipate how different people will respond to various situations, understanding the hidden motivations that drive human behavior, and recognizing the patterns that most people remain blind to. It involves studying human nature not as an academic exercise but as a practical necessity for effective action in the world. Such understanding develops through careful observation of people in various circumstances, analysis of historical patterns, and constant testing of theories against reality. The strategically minded person learns to read beneath surface presentations, to identify the real interests that motivate apparent positions, and to predict behavior based on fundamental human drives rather than stated intentions. This analytical capability must be coupled with emotional discipline that prevents personal feelings from distorting perception. The strategist cannot afford to see what he wishes to see or to interpret events through the lens of his own hopes and fears. Reality must be perceived as it actually exists, not as it appears through the filter of personal desire or social conditioning. The development of such clear seeing requires constant vigilance against the natural human tendency toward self-deception. Most people unconsciously edit their perceptions to maintain comfortable beliefs about themselves and their situations. The aspiring strategist must systematically eliminate this editing process, learning to see uncomfortable truths about himself, others, and circumstances without flinching or looking away. Mental toughness emerges naturally from this process of honest perception and emotional discipline. When a man no longer needs to protect comfortable illusions about himself or the world, he becomes capable of facing any truth and dealing with any situation. This creates a form of psychological invulnerability that cannot be achieved through external circumstances alone. The mentally disciplined person develops what might be called strategic patience, the ability to endure present discomfort for future advantage, to wait for the right moment to act rather than being driven by urgency or external pressure. This patience is not passive but active, involving constant preparation, observation, and planning while waiting for optimal conditions. Such patience requires understanding that true power often comes from knowing when not to act as much as knowing when to act. The impulsive person reveals his intentions too early, commits resources at suboptimal times, and often achieves the opposite of what he intended because he cannot wait for circumstances to align properly. The strategic mind also cultivates adaptability without losing core principles. This involves understanding the difference between tactical flexibility and strategic consistency. Tactics may change based on circumstances, but the fundamental commitment to mental discipline and strategic thinking must remain constant regardless of external conditions. This adaptability prevents the kind of rigid thinking that makes men predictable and vulnerable. The person who can only respond to situations in predetermined ways becomes easy to manipulate and defeat. True mental strength lies in maintaining strategic clarity while adapting methods to changing conditions. The process of mental development must be systematic and ongoing rather than sporadic or temporary. Like physical training, mental discipline requires consistent practice and progressive challenge. The mind that is not regularly tested and strengthened will inevitably weaken when faced with serious challenges. This systematic approach involves creating specific practices for developing different aspects of mental discipline, regular analysis of decisions and their outcomes, deliberate exposure to challenging situations that test emotional control, structured study of human behavior and historical patterns, and consistent application of strategic thinking to everyday decisions. The goal is not perfection but, rather, the development of reliable mental habits that function effectively under pressure. When crisis arrives, there will be no time to develop discipline or learn strategic thinking. These capabilities must already be deeply ingrained through long practice before they are desperately needed. The transformation from weak to strong mentality creates what Machiavelli observed as a kind of personal sovereignty, the ability to maintain control over one's responses and decisions regardless of external circumstances. This sovereignty becomes the foundation for all other forms of power and influence, because it ensures that whatever authority or resources a person acquires will be used effectively rather than squandered through poor decision-making. Men who have not achieved this internal sovereignty remain slaves to circumstances, reactive rather than proactive, responding to events rather than shaping them. They may accumulate external power temporarily, but they will inevitably lose it because they lack the mental discipline necessary to maintain and expand their positions effectively. The disciplined mind creates its own advantages by seeing opportunities that others miss, avoiding mistakes that others make repeatedly, and maintaining effectiveness when others are overwhelmed by pressure or complexity. These advantages compound over time, creating increasingly significant differences in outcomes between those who have mastered their minds and those who have not. As this mental reconstruction progresses, it becomes apparent that the weak self was not merely an obstacle to overcome but actually an invitation to destruction. Every uncontrolled emotion, every undisciplined thought, every reactive response serves as a signal to others that here is someone who can be manipulated, predicted, and ultimately controlled. The destruction of this weak self removes these signals and creates instead the presence of someone who cannot be easily read, predicted, or controlled by others. Part 2, The Mechanics of Strategic Supremacy. The second phase of Machiavellian mental strategy involves understanding that having destroyed the weak self, one must now construct something far more formidable in its place. This is not merely about becoming stronger in obvious ways, but about developing forms of strategic thinking that operate on multiple levels simultaneously, creating layers of advantage that compound and reinforce each other. The foundation of this construction lies in what Machiavelli observed as the ability to hold contradictory truths in mind without becoming paralyzed by the apparent inconsistency. The weak mind seeks simple answers and clear categories, desperately wanting the world to be more predictable and manageable than it actually is. The strategic mind embraces complexity and ambiguity as natural features of reality that can be navigated and exploited rather than obstacles to be eliminated. This capacity for complexity begins with understanding that most situations contain multiple valid interpretations, each of which may be useful for different purposes. The strategist learns to shift between these interpretations fluidly, selecting the perspective that provides the greatest advantage for current objectives while remaining aware that other interpretations exist and may become more useful as circumstances change. Such mental flexibility prevents the kind of ideological rigidity that makes people predictable and exploitable. When someone's worldview can be accurately mapped, their responses to various situations become foreseeable, and they can be manipulated by anyone who understands their mental frameworks well enough to trigger predictable reactions. The strategically minded person develops what might be called interpretive sovereignty, the ability to frame events in whatever way serves their purposes best, rather than being trapped by conventional interpretations or emotional reactions to how events are typically understood. This does not mean creating false narratives, but rather recognizing that events can be truthfully interpreted in multiple ways, and choosing interpretations that enhance rather than diminish one's strategic position. This interpretive flexibility must be coupled with what Machiavelli understood as temporal thinking, the ability to operate effectively across different time horizons simultaneously. Most people are trapped in either short-term reactive thinking or vague long-term hoping. The strategic mind learns to coordinate immediate actions with medium-term positioning and long-term objectives, ensuring that present decisions support rather than undermine future possibilities. Temporal thinking requires understanding that the same action can have completely different meanings and consequences depending on timing. What appears to be failure in the short term may be positioning for long-term advantage, while what seems like immediate success may create future vulnerabilities. The ability to evaluate actions across multiple time horizons prevents the kind of short-sighted decision-making that characterizes weak strategic thinking. The development of systematic influence represents another crucial element of strategic supremacy. This involves understanding not merely how to persuade people in obvious ways, but how to shape the frameworks through which they interpret events and make decisions. Rather than arguing with someone's conclusions, the strategic mind learns to influence the premises from which those conclusions are drawn. Such influence operates through what might be called environmental design, structuring situations so that other people's natural decision-making processes lead them toward outcomes that serve the strategist's purposes. This is far more powerful than direct persuasion because it works with human nature rather than against it, and because people believe they are making their own choices rather than being manipulated. Environmental design requires deep understanding of how people actually make decisions, as opposed to how they think they make decisions or how they claim to make decisions. Most decision-making is driven by unconscious factors, emotional associations, social pressures, cognitive shortcuts, and inherited patterns of thinking that operate below the level of conscious awareness. The strategic mind learns to identify and work with these unconscious factors rather than focusing exclusively on rational arguments or obvious incentives. This creates influence that feels natural and comfortable to others because it aligns with their existing mental patterns rather than fighting against them. Information management becomes another critical capability for strategic supremacy. This involves not merely gathering information effectively, but understanding how to control the flow of information in ways that support strategic objectives. The person who can influence what others know, when they know it, and how they interpret what they know possesses enormous strategic advantages. Information management operates on multiple levels, controlling what information is revealed and concealed, timing the release of information for maximum impact, framing information in ways that suggest particular interpretations, and understanding how different people will process and respond to the same information differently. The strategic mind also develops what might be called predictive modeling, the ability to anticipate how various people will respond to different situations based on understanding their character patterns, incentive structures, and decision-making habits. This is not about predicting specific details, but about forecasting the general directions of people's responses with sufficient accuracy to plan effectively. Such modeling requires extensive study of human nature combined with careful observation of specific individuals. The strategist learns to identify the core drives and fears that motivate different people, the cognitive patterns they use to interpret events, and the behavioral tendencies they display under various pressures. This predictive capability enables what Machiavelli called being prepared for what fortune brings, not trying to control every external variable, but positioning oneself to benefit from likely developments while being ready to adapt if unexpected events occur. The strategic mind creates robust rather than fragile plans, designed to work across a range of possible futures rather than depending on specific outcomes. Resource optimization represents another dimension of strategic thinking that goes far beyond simple efficiency. The strategic mind understands that resources, whether time, attention, money, relationships, or reputation, must be allocated not just for immediate needs but to create future capabilities and opportunities. This involves understanding the difference between consuming resources and investing them. Consumption depletes resources for temporary benefits, while investment converts present resources into future capabilities that can generate ongoing advantages. The strategic mind constantly seeks ways to turn necessary expenditures into investments that build long-term strategic position. Resource optimization also requires understanding leverage, how to use limited resources to achieve disproportionate results. This might involve identifying key pressure points where small actions create large effects, finding ways to use other people's resources to advance one's own objectives, or timing actions to coincide with favorable circumstances that amplify their impact. The development of strategic alliances becomes crucial for multiplying individual capabilities beyond what can be achieved through personal effort alone. This involves understanding not just how to form beneficial relationships, but how to structure them so that mutual benefit increases over time rather than declining through conflict or competition. Strategic alliance building requires understanding different people's core interests and finding ways to align those interests with one's own objectives. Rather than trying to convince people to help for altruistic reasons, the strategic mind creates situations where helping serves their self-interest as well. Such alliances must be designed to be anti-fragile, becoming stronger under stress rather than breaking when challenges arise. This requires understanding potential sources of conflict in advance and building structures that channel competitive energies in productive directions rather than allowing them to become destructive. The strategic mind also cultivates what might be called optionality, the ability to maintain multiple possible courses of action while committing fully to current activities. This prevents the kind of premature closure that locks people into suboptimal paths when better alternatives become available. Maintaining optionality requires understanding the difference between strategic commitment and tactical flexibility. Strategic commitments involve core principles and long-term directions that should not be abandoned lightly, while tactical approaches should be adjusted constantly based on changing circumstances and new information. This balance between commitment and flexibility enables what Machiavelli observed as the ability to be both the fox and the lion, using cunning when force is inappropriate and using force when cunning is insufficient, but always maintaining the strategic clarity to recognize which approach fits current circumstances. The culmination of these various capabilities creates what might be called strategic omnidirectional thinking, the ability to consider any situation from multiple perspectives simultaneously and to identify approaches that serve multiple objectives at once. Rather than thinking linearly about single goals, the strategic mind learns to think systemically about how different objectives can be advanced together. This omnidirectional capability prevents the kind of narrow focus that causes people to sacrifice important secondary objectives for minor primary gains, or to create long-term problems while solving short-term challenges. The strategic mind seeks solutions that strengthen overall position rather than merely addressing immediate concerns. As these capabilities develop and integrate, they create a form of strategic consciousness that operates automatically rather than requiring constant deliberate effort. Just as a musician eventually plays complex pieces without thinking about individual notes, the strategic mind eventually navigates complex situations without having to consciously analyze every element.
This automatic strategic functioning represents the transition from learning strategic thinking to becoming a strategic thinker.
At this point, the various elements of mental discipline, systematic analysis, and environmental awareness become integrated into a unified way of perceiving and responding to the world that operates naturally and continuously. The person who has achieved this integration has effectively destroyed not only their weak self but also their vulnerable self. They have created a form of consciousness that cannot be easily surprised, manipulated, or overwhelmed because it operates from a position of systematic understanding rather than reactive response. Part 3, The Invincible Position and Perpetual Advantage. The final phase of Machiavellian mental strategy transcends mere tactical superiority and enters the realm of what might be called strategic invincibility, not the impossible dream of never facing challenges or opposition, but the practical reality of maintaining advantage regardless of external circumstances. This represents the culmination of mental discipline where the person has become genuinely undefeatable because they have eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that others could exploit. The invincible position emerges from understanding that true security comes not from controlling external circumstances, which is ultimately impossible, but from developing internal capabilities that remain effective regardless of what external circumstances arise. When a person's strategic effectiveness depends on favorable conditions, they remain vulnerable to anyone who can create unfavorable conditions. When their effectiveness transcends specific conditions, they become impossible to defeat through environmental manipulation. This transition begins with recognizing that most people's strategic thinking is fundamentally defensive, focused on protecting what they have rather than continuously expanding their capabilities and advantages. Defensive thinking inevitably leads to defeat because it accepts the enemy's initiative and merely responds to threats rather than creating them. The invincible position, by contrast, is fundamentally generative, constantly creating new advantages, opportunities, and capabilities that compound over time. The generative approach requires understanding what Machiavelli observed as the principle of continuous expansion. This does not mean territorial or material expansion necessarily, but rather the ongoing development of strategic capabilities that make one more formidable over time rather than remaining static or gradually weakening. Every situation becomes an opportunity to develop new skills, test strategic theories, or strengthen existing capabilities. This continuous development creates what might be called adaptive advantage, the ability to become stronger precisely because of challenges rather than despite them. While most people are weakened by difficulties and strengthened by ease, the strategically developed person reverses this pattern, using obstacles as training opportunities and comfortable periods for preparation and skill development. Adaptive advantage prevents the natural human tendency toward complacency that develops when circumstances are favorable. Instead of relaxing when things are going well, the strategic mind uses good times to prepare for inevitable future challenges, understanding that present advantages can disappear quickly if they are not continuously reinforced and expanded. The development of this adaptive capacity requires what might be called anti-fragile thinking, designing approaches that benefit from volatility and uncertainty rather than being damaged by them. While most people seek to minimize uncertainty and create predictable environments, the strategic mind learns to position itself to benefit from whatever happens rather than depending on specific outcomes. Anti-fragile positioning involves understanding that uncertainty creates opportunities for those who are prepared to recognize and act on them, while it creates problems for those who depend on predictability. The strategic mind develops capabilities that work across a wide range of conditions rather than optimizing for specific scenarios. This positioning enables what Machiavelli understood as the ability to profit from fortune and misfortune alike. When circumstances are favorable, the strategic person accelerates their development and expansion. When circumstances are unfavorable, they use the situation to strengthen capabilities that will provide advantages when conditions improve. In both cases, they become more formidable over time. The mastery of strategic timing represents another crucial element of invincible positioning. This involves understanding not just when to act for immediate advantage, but how to coordinate actions across time to create cumulative effects that build toward long-term strategic objectives. The strategic mind learns to think in terms of campaigns rather than battles, understanding that individual actions derive their meaning from how they contribute to larger patterns. Strategic timing requires developing sensitivity to what might be called the natural rhythms of situations, understanding when people and circumstances are ready for certain kinds of influence or change, and when pushing too hard will create resistance that undermines long-term objectives. This involves learning to work with momentum rather than against it, accelerating natural processes rather than forcing artificial ones. Such timing sensitivity enables the strategic mind to achieve results with minimal effort by acting at precisely the right moments rather than trying to force outcomes through excessive energy or resources. This efficiency creates sustainable advantage because it allows for continuous action without exhaustion or overextension.
The cultivation of systematic unpredictability represents another dimension of invincible positioning.
While maintaining internal consistency and strategic coherence, the strategically developed person learns to avoid behavioral patterns that others can map and exploit. This involves varying approaches, timing, and methods while maintaining focus on core objectives. Systematic unpredictability prevents enemies from developing effective counter-strategies because they cannot accurately forecast specific actions, even if they understand general capabilities and objectives. This creates a form of tactical advantage that compounds over time as others waste resources preparing for possibilities rather than dealing with realities. The development of such unpredictability must be balanced with reliability in areas where trust and consistency serve strategic purposes. The strategic mind learns to distinguish between situations where unpredictability creates advantage and situations where consistency builds stronger long-term position. Resource generation becomes critical for maintaining invincible position over extended periods. This involves not merely conserving or optimizing existing resources, but developing capabilities that continuously create new resources. The strategic mind understands that true security comes from generative capacity rather than stored assets, because stored assets can be depleted or taken while generative capacity continues producing advantage. Resource generation operates on multiple levels, developing skills that create ongoing value, building relationships that provide continuing benefits, creating systems that generate results with minimal ongoing input, and establishing positions that naturally attract opportunities and resources. Each of these provides forms of wealth that are difficult for others to eliminate or steal. The strategic mind also develops what might be called reputational capital, carefully cultivated perceptions that create advantages across multiple situations and relationships. This involves understanding that reputation, properly managed, becomes a resource that generates opportunities, discourages opposition, and attracts valuable connections. Building strategic reputation requires consistency between actions and carefully chosen public positions over extended periods. The strategic mind selects reputational investments that will provide long-term advantages rather than short-term social approval, understanding that true strategic reputation comes from demonstrated capability rather than popular opinion. Network effects become increasingly important as strategic development progresses. The invincible position ultimately depends not just on individual capability but on being embedded in networks of relationships, information flows, and resource exchanges that provide ongoing advantage. The strategic mind learns to position itself at valuable network intersections rather than on isolated peripheries. Strategic networking involves understanding different types of relationships and their various functions, information sources, capability amplifiers, resource providers, influence channels, and opportunity generators. Rather than treating all relationships the same way, the strategic mind optimizes each relationship for its particular strategic value. Such networking must be genuine rather than manipulative to be sustainable over time. The strategic mind learns to create mutual value in relationships rather than simply extracting benefits, understanding that relationships based on mutual advantage are more stable and valuable than those based on one-sided exploitation. The integration of all these capabilities creates what might be called strategic presence, a form of influence that operates continuously rather than requiring specific actions. People with developed strategic presence shape situations simply by being part of them, because others naturally adjust their behavior based on awareness of the strategic person's capabilities and likely responses. Strategic presence emerges from the combination of demonstrated competence, systematic thinking, emotional discipline, and the kind of confidence that comes from genuine capability rather than false bravado. It cannot be faked or performed because it depends on actual capacity that becomes apparent through patterns of action over time. This presence creates what Machiavelli observed as the ability to influence events while appearing to be merely responding to them. Others cannot point to specific manipulative actions, yet situations consistently develop in ways that serve the strategic person's interests because their very participation in situations subtly alters the dynamics in favorable directions. The achievement of strategic presence marks the transition to what might be called perpetual advantage, a condition where the person continues to become more formidable over time regardless of specific circumstances. Every experience adds to their strategic understanding, every relationship expands their capabilities, and every challenge strengthens their adaptive capacity. Perpetual advantage does not mean never facing difficulties or opposition, but rather having developed capabilities that turn any situation into an opportunity for further strategic development. The person with perpetual advantage welcomes challenges because they have learned to extract value from any experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant. This creates a fundamental reversal of normal human vulnerability. Instead of being weakened by opposition and strengthened by comfort, the strategically developed person becomes stronger precisely through facing and overcoming opposition while using comfortable periods for preparation and skill development. The final achievement of Machiavellian mental strategy is the creation of a form of consciousness that cannot be defeated because it has eliminated the internal contradictions and vulnerabilities that create defeatable positions. This consciousness operates from systematic understanding rather than emotional reactivity, generates resources rather than merely consuming them, and creates opportunities rather than merely responding to them. The person who has achieved this development has literally destroyed their weak self so thoroughly that they have become unrecognizable to their former self. They have replaced reactive patterns with strategic responses, defensive thinking with generative approaches, and vulnerable emotional patterns with disciplined consciousness that maintains effectiveness under any circumstances. This transformation represents not merely an improvement in existing capabilities but a fundamental reconstruction of consciousness itself. The strategically developed person thinks differently, perceives differently, and responds differently because they have systematically eliminated the mental patterns that create vulnerability and replaced them with patterns that create and maintain advantage. The result is a form of practical invincibility that emerges not from external protections but from internal development. Such a person cannot be destroyed by others because they have already destroyed everything within themselves that could be exploited for their destruction. They have become, in Machiavelli's profound insight, truly undefeatable through the systematic elimination of their own weaknesses and the cultivation of strategic consciousness that generates perpetual advantage. This achievement represents the highest development of human strategic capability, not the accumulation of power over others, but the cultivation of forms of thinking and acting that create sustainable advantage through superior understanding and disciplined application of strategic principles. It is the transformation that Machiavelli understood as the difference between those who shape events and those who are shaped by them, between those who create their own fortune and those who remain subject to the whims of circumstances they neither understand nor control.